25 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 seconds. Dr. Holloway, leader of the Los Alamos group, and the entire fleet waits in almost agonized tenseness. Now but 5 seconds to go, and...
The story of Godzilla Minus One is not one of childlike reverence for a mighty hero to defend the Earth. It is not a message in allocating preventative measures and keeping the Earth safe from human pollution, nor does it carry into the high-class B-mores of the 90s Heisei era films. What could hardly be described as any such movie born from the necessity of maintaining a stronghold over the film industry in an attempt to maintain its relevancy. So much more for the fact in its desire to depict a story unlike any other in this franchise for having resembled its original predecessor, while standing so proudly on its own for the ability to display such a harrowing experience of carnage through such a spectacle of fantastic and horrifying means. This film cannot be so easily classified into any category that its messaging would be so reminiscent of its predecessor in understanding the events that took place which led to its creation. That of which the end of World War II and the proliferation of nuclear dealings would have created such a legendary figure that its cult status as a small-budget monster flick from the 1950s would have dealt such a crippling blow to the mainstream Japanese audiences at the time as a haunting reminder for the damage that had been dealt to its people only 10 years prior. Allegories pertaining to the detriment of nuclear armament have always been a pivotal point for this franchise, some using it more often than others as the focal point for their stories. Such a degree of caution on the part of prophesizing the eventual annihilation of the world lest the world counter the era of nuclear warfare, that such a point would have been raised in the original film from 1954, only to continuously be sidelined for the purpose in telling so many different stories that would only ever continue to stray so far from the original message of that first film. A film whose opening detailed many young men having been affected by the nuclear fallout of the very incident which had derived inspiration from the real-life occurrence of the Lucky Dragon incident, an event where an American testing of the hydrogen bomb would become the focal point for the basis of not only the original film, but for a similar occurrence through the Bikini Atoll bombing tests to be utilized for the story of Godzilla Minus One. Though this harrowing incident which would create this nuclear abomination not be brought about until that much later, the film is still able to so expertly weave that aspect of the story through the introduction of its characters in the first few minutes of its opening alone. There we meet Koichi Shikishima, a kamikaze pilot sent out in the final days of World War II as he lands on the island of Odo. Having been given such a brief glimpse of this young pilot, can we gauge such a thorough read of his character? A frantic and troubled young man plagued by self-doubt and fear for the anxiety built through the realization that such a short life lived would be gone so quickly for the sake of sacrificing his life for a cause that he himself would have carried no measure of support for, but for we the audience to question whether he would be able to so fully accept that what he believed to be doing is morally correct. A line of questioning that he asks himself when the lead technician, Tachibana, questions Shikishima as to the reason for his landing when no such errors were found on his ship, that he would immediately become so nervous as to avoid even looking his comrade in the eyes, only to walk away, left alone to ponder the consequences for his lack of action, only to further become so conflicted for another technician to voice his support for that decision, that the technician and Shikishima would believe the entire basis for a kamikaze pilot to be so useless in sacrificing a life for a cause when all but leading to nothing more than a higher level of death for a war that had already been lost. For all of that fear to reach a boiling point which would completely overtake his psyche upon the emergence of an ancient beast upon the compound. For the very first film in this series to describe such an entity in such a parasitic fashion of having been described in such a manner and becoming a local legend described by the villagers as a primordial creature of the sea that was given sacrificial offerings as a form of peace, only for that very legend to take form through this devil of the sea set about to decimate any and all creatures that would dare to cross its path. Those specific instances of destruction having been so much more impactful in this one moment than they would have been had its characters not been so carefully fleshed out. Any film that would display the greatest visual effects in the world would not be enough to mask any other issues that could be brushed aside simply for the sake of the pure visual splendor alone. 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, 2021's Kong vs. Godzilla, and Godzilla x Kong The New Empire being clear indicators that no manner of budgetary leeway or cause for celebration should the characters be more hollow than the very ideas that their stories are based upon. The assault on Odo Island inherently proving that such a scope of realism can be so properly implemented through the careful application in how the real world is utilized. This scene presented as nothing more than to display all but a mere fraction of this creature's fury and power. This purveyor of death surveying the land, ever patient in the search for its prey. The hunt only made so much more enjoyable for the patience this ancient being would exude with every agonizing, lumbering step into the earth. The only hope for salvation in a field of decay and death resting upon Shikishima's shoulders, only to freeze upon this creature's waning gaze. What was so briefly touched upon in the original 1954 film being displayed so prominently here in a scene carrying such levels of tension through having this creature unleash such a hellacious act of unbridled death. Not simply as a mindless beast acting purely on the instinctual drive for hunger, but for an entity so methodical through its intent in the hunt for blood. A hunger sought to be filled by this beast which would bring about the end for the crew of the island of Odo. Lives taken underfoot, torn asunder by the jaws of death, thrown aside into the endless void of the night, for a man's death to be brought about not from the mechanical muzzle of artillery fire, but from a predator set loose on this island. The very irony in Tachibana having questioned Shikishima's intentions earlier on in his refusal to fight, that very same refusal was what had saved him from this creature's wrath, if only for that level of indecision to have led to the moment that would have cost him and his crew dearly. For such a creature to emerge from the nightmare of a man so wrought with the terrors of war that its brief respite from that war would only take form through the emergence of such a demonic entity, one that would methodically destroy nearly every man on that island, that both Tachibana and Shikishima would be left to deal with the remnants of the attack. One for the loss of his fellow servicemen, the other for having been responsible for their deaths. Like Ishiro Honda, the director of the first Godzilla film, Koichi Shikishima is a man wrestling with his conscience over choosing to fight for his country, all the while adhering to his own beliefs. Ishiro Honda's conscription as a soldier during World War II made all the more difficult by his strict pacifism, while simultaneously having Koichi being conscripted as a kamikaze pilot. He, like many men around the world, be they American or Japanese, having been forced into such circumstances by their superiors into fighting a war that they themselves wished to avoid in the first place. With the level of damage inflicted from the calamity wrought upon the world with the lingering after effects of World War I, only to bear witness to yet another war, one may consider that the Japanese were indeed the very individuals who adopted the spark that ignited the war with the bombings of Pearl Harbor. But then one must face the realization that any such small group does not epitomize the majority. 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla made such a point abundantly clear when Junko begged the island natives to assist them in defeating Godzilla.
一言聞いてください。皆さんの人間不信の気持ちはよくわかります。でもこうしている間にもゴジラのために命を落としていく人たちがいるのです。その中にはいい人たちだってたくさんいます。たとえ悪い人間だって生きる権利はあるはずです。皆さんは神の報いだとおっしゃるかもしれません。でも神はすべてに平等です。エコひいきはなさらないはずです。お願いです。力を貸してください。
While indeed therein lie the men that were responsible for not only the destruction of their island, but for the expropriation of the egg of their goddess Mothra. But just as there were those guilty, so too were those that were innocent. Such a level of innocence that comprised the background for Shikishima's character, only to be ripped apart so mercilessly by means of an ancient creature having emerged from the depths in an assault of nightmarish proportions, an encounter which will give one pause for thought upon Tachibana's vehement exclamations towards the deaths of those men lying solely on the shoulders of Shikishima. A moment which would allow its viewers to consider just how true Tachibana's words would be for the possibility of how effective Shikishima's plane may have been for its ability to inflict any damage upon this creature. Whether its ability to draw any damage being left to the individual to consider, for whether Shikishima's fear driving his being what may or may not have inevitably saved his life, for the uncertainty in how effective the plane may have been. Though the indecision through fear has led to those deaths, it was what would have ultimately been Shikishima's salvation for having prevented its death in that very moment. The very death which is the enemy of every soldier, the realm through which no man will enter to return, the one conquest that no individual would ever emerge victorious. A point made all the more clear upon the traveling ferry shepherding those returning soldiers who had survived the war. Every individual merely an empty husk housing a man having once been filled with such a pride that had been utterly decimated. for that very pride to be diminished with the knowledge of those having been killed, be they on the battlefield or in the homeland. Those very lives lost being a reminder for Shikishima, with Tachibana forcing the memories of those men onto him through the envelope of photos. All of this, only to return home to a country that had been ravaged to become nothing more than a barren wasteland, having been completely annihilated, a field of death, one through which he must navigate, with Shikishima's findings having been relegated to discovering little to no friends or family left alive. For Shikishima, his death lies through his guilt for directly leading to the graves of those doomed on Odo Island. For Tachibana, it lies with the men whom he had lost on Odo Island by means of Shikishima having been responsible for his failure to act. For Sumiko, it lies on the graves of her children having been killed in the firebombing raids. All of this culminating in an excruciatingly heart-wrenching confrontation in which this mother, who had already lost everything, being forced to witness the return of a man whom she believed to already be dead. A dead man's return being cause for her accusations towards that man having destroyed his honor while simultaneously being responsible for the deaths of not only her own children, but for the deaths of his own parents and country. A country devastated from the lingering effects of the atomic bombs, those which not only led to the deaths of its citizens, but for the birth of a new evil. The destruction that Godzilla would bring forth upon Japan being just as devastating as the effects that lingered after the annihilation that American forces had wrought in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Such devastating power behind those concurring events that the fallout would be all the more traumatic for those having survived the two bombings and fire raids, with those remaining that the mental fortitude of those survivors would have been so desecrated to such a point of ruin. An ocean of destruction that Shikishima must wade through, only to discover the remnants of his former home lying in complete ruin. Within the rubble would Shikishima discover the last remaining vestiges of his parents, a final bequest for him to come back alive. A statement so tantamount for how Shikishima's conscience has played against his better moral judgment for having abandoned his duty against having made the decision in doing so in order to appease his parents' wishes. That the only reason that this request had been fulfilled post-mortem, if only having been achieved for a soldier to disgrace his name and having abandoned his country for having foregone the responsibility he had once held towards his mission. A mission abandoned which would have led him towards a new assignment, one of a moral level in which a young woman would have both figuratively and literally thrust upon him. With an infant having been handed to him that his initial selfishness would have persevered if not for his guilt having emerged yet again for his inevitable decision to take care of this child born of the war. That this decision would have led for this young woman to return to reclaim the child that Shikishima had then decided to let them both stay, albeit in a desolate land of rubble and ruin, but one in which they, much like the rest of its denizens, would adapt to in order to survive. Such survival that individuals such as Sumiko would emerge as one of the strongest focal points in this story. Sumiko is perhaps one of the best written characters to emerge in any film in recent years. To have such an individual be brought forth and not only dealing with the ramifications of her husband being thrust into a war that she had absolutely no interest in, only to then be brought to the lowest point imaginable for any mother to have been forced into such a position and having witnessed the deaths of her 3 children. Such as it is that her home country had been sunk to the level of 0, only to be thrust into the negative zone upon the realization that her home country had lost the war that they themselves had initiated. For the understanding that the war that had started for no reason, having only ended with her home country having been torn completely asunder in a sea of flames, only in being so helpless in witnessing her family having burnt to death in such a chaotic wave of destruction. All of this, and being forced to wake every day with the crushing weight of abandonment and complete isolation, to then being confronted by one of the young men that had been conscripted to fight that war having returned home after having fled from his duty. A duty that she wholeheartedly purported to believe that he would have been able to prevent the deaths of her entire family had he chosen to follow in his mission, rather than fleeing from it. Those deaths being what Shikishima has acknowledged upon having returned home that he would have immediately accepted his shame for having failed in his duty. No measure of pride allowing him to defend his honor, to defend his character against this woman's accusations from having fled. All of this building towards such levels of animosity that Sumiko would declare her indifference, only to continue the establishment and growth of her character by means of her caring nature emerging towards Akiko. With what had been previously established for Sumiko having been so furious towards Shikishima that she would have suddenly given them what little of her rights that she possessed. What one may view initially as contradictory is not quite what it would appear for being disproven in consideration to Sumiko's justifications. For having previously shown that Sumiko had stated that she was done caring, then for what purpose would Sumiko have for having given away what meager rations that she possessed? With having learned that Noriko was not the child's mother, nor could she breastfeed, perhaps for her maternal instincts emerging so naturally, that she would have made the decision to save the life of this young child, for she would have had no reason to give the rice to Shikishima. One for her still carrying such resentment towards him, as well as stating explicitly that it was not for him or Noriko, but for the young child who had been orphaned by the war. As Sumiko had stated so bluntly, adults can survive on anything. As a mother suffering from the loss of her children to the war, there should be no reason for any mother to want to bear witness to any other child's suffering if given the chance to offer whatever aid they can. Such aid that Shikishima feels he must undertake with having secured a position on the sea as a minesweeper. Not only so well integrated for Shikishima's sense of responsibility in caring for Noriko and Akiko, but for him to deliberately undertake such a well-paying job for the detriment of it being the cause in his safety being so compromised, that he would have claimed this job for the attempt in persevering towards whatever sense of duty he feels he may fulfill. If not for having failed as a pilot, but with the damage left over from the war, the job of reclamation for the decommissioned sea mines would be such a harrowing experience, for the level of irony of a war through which its citizens would be forced to participate in by its leaders. A war in which, after all that had been fought and lost, those very same individuals would be the ones to clean up the remnants of such a conflict, that the very leaders given the responsibility to lead had only led to the irreversible damage of its country, that any remaining bout of responsibility would be, yet again, swept aside for the purpose in having their citizens take part in the cleanup instead. A cleanup in which Shikishima would assure Noriko of his safety, for the merit of the boats being used to do so would be specially made. This moment being a legitimately humorous moment for the immediate cut towards displaying the boat that Shikishima would be traveling aboard upon his realization that such a specially made craft would have amounted to nothing more than a rundown wooden dinghy. Though so very dilapidated, it was indeed made for that explicit purpose for evading the mines and its ability to repel the magnetic nature of the mines due to it being made of wood. Though small, its ability to serve its crew would be put to the test through the figurative and literal method of sweeping through the ocean for mines, that their initial success would be a cause for pause for the members of this crew. A crew comprised of Akitsu, a grizzled sea captain despondent with the current government for its subpar leadership and lack of organization, Mr. Kenji Noda, a former Navy technical officer, a calm, stoic man whose wit and brevity are means for success, no matter the venture, and lastly Shiro Mizushima, a proud young man who dreams of adventure. For Mizushima, his initial impression of Shikishima's wartime experience to be that of a cause for celebration, before lamenting the end of the war before wishing for it to have continued for far longer, not only for the nationalism of a young man proud of his country, but for such desperation of youthful naivete for the call to adventure while simultaneously struggling to understand the idea of how damaging war could truly be. With Shikishima having so silently, yet quickly become enraged for such a request to have been fulfilled, for having witnessed firsthand the annihilation and devastation inflicted from such an era of war, a war through which such effects would linger through this young man's mind, a strength to which he must rely upon lest the turmoil of his experiences emerge once again, much like the nightmares that plague his mind every night. Yet he perseveres to rebuild his life, forge new bonds, begin to understand the love and companionship that he has so vehemently denied himself in order to live, and create a new home for the people that he has grown to love, if only for a short time, to learn to forgive himself. For just as Shikishima has acknowledged the past, would it finally re-emerge for him to confront, with news alerting the military of the impending arrival of this ever-growing threat, would Shikishima's will be tested in a confrontation unlike any other we have ever witnessed before. With the might of the military having been so well established in other variations of this media, would we bear witness to the resilience and stranglehold this aquatic beast would hold over the ocean, that this encounter would not be fought with conventional weaponry. Shikishima's panic emerging full force, his initial hesitancy re-emerging once again, his ever-growing fear being the very inspiration to summon the strength needed to fight back, for the sins of the past to remain dormant. Those ghosts having returned full force through the method in which Godzilla would have been reintegrated into the film by means of the nuclear bombing tests on Bikini Atoll. The very test which would have enabled this creature to enact its revenge, through which its aggression would be displayed through the damage inflicted on the many American warships documented through the reels of footage displayed by military forces. Whether the needs of the many would outweigh the needs of the few is a question one must consider, for how the Japanese government would have forced the crew of the Shinsei Maru in essentially giving the order to pose as bait while waiting for the arrival of this creature in order to be properly dealt with. That they had reached such a point that the military would have continued to exude such an exhausting lack of morality in forcing this crew to become all but sitting ducks for the method in dealing with this creature can only continue to illustrate the war only continuing to loom over this country. No war shall ever truly die, for its cycle will only continue to spread in a new pattern, with what could be expected of a tumultuous turn for humanity to aspire to come forth to rebuild, only for a new war to arise. For the death of the Second World War would a cold one emerge, one which would have prevented such a measure of aid encountering a new threat to the people that would be so easily ignored for the sake of avoiding any responsibility for the beginnings of a Third World War. A lesson that would forever be taught to its leaders, but one that would never be learned. Such as it is that its citizens would be left astray once again, to deal with the ramifications of a nuclear threat posed to their country in the form of what could only be described as a nuclear bomb in slow motion. Just as these civilians had been forced to fight a war that they wanted to avoid, so too were they forced yet again to confront another, this one fought with such a measure of confusion and fear. Their fear of force displayed so prominently through the absolute terror and confusion marring their features upon having witnessed the destroyed warship. A warship having been absolutely decimated that their initial surprise would have been overtaken by a sense of fear. For Tachibana earlier having questioned whether the air raid sirens were for a new weapon developed by the Americans, with Mizushima here having questioned if the Soviets had also developed a new weapon. This film having so expertly crafted a world whose ever-growing paranoia mirrored the real-life wave of fear that loomed over these countries at the time. Such fear through which Akitsu would express his frustration for his country's leadership in being so blind to ignore the threat posed to their country that he would have vehemently denied any involvement with these orders given. Yet despite his misgivings, he would still be so endeared to his homeland that he would follow the orders regardless, not for the sake of its leaders, but for the welfare and future of its people. These characters have been so well integrated throughout the entirety of this story for the merits of having been built upon such a solid foundation, not for the basis of this plot revolving around the central protagonist that they would have been merely shunned to the side, but that they themselves expressed their own unique interests and displayed such distinctive personalities that they would have stood out in their own right, not for servicing the plot or the main characters, but in service to themselves. Their trust in one another solidified through the commonalities while understanding their differences, healing through the damage inflicted from the war through each other while teaching the younger generation how to survive in their own right. Any potential threat of panic marring their lives being handled through the relationships that they forged through each other. The fear that they would have felt upon receiving their new orders to stall for time to contain this new threat that they would persevere regardless by relying on each other. Such fear that Akitsu, the pessimistic leader so distrusting of his own government, would have then decided to fight back. For his having survived one war that he would not wish to bear witness to his homeland being ravaged and torn asunder through the raging fires of another. Although this level of determination is to be commended, it's with a level of irony that the moment that these men would witness such a creature emerging from the depths that he would then decide to escape. Not for a sense of cowardice, but that the film had treated its characters so seriously that the initial moment of determination would be undercut with a slightly humorous tone of understanding how dire the situation was. That he would have been intelligent enough to understand that some battles were already lost, so why follow the orders to die when you could choose to live? The arc that Shikishima would eventually face being the very same point being illustrated here through the captain choosing to save his men by escaping. An escape accompanied by a creature whose mere presence alone would have been cause for panic, but that the ensuing chase would be all the more terrifying in understanding how this creature was so consciously aware of the fear that he was eliciting. Not a mindless beast attacking an enemy, but a hunter enjoying the chase of its prey. For any other media to have been held to such a standard that the excuse of fear causing a cascade of stupidity would not be applicable here. In this instance, none of these characters have made any mistakes whatsoever. They have only ever continued to make a progressive level of intelligent decisions that they believed would have resulted in the death of this beast. If not for the ship's gun causing any damage, then surely one of the underwater mines would. If not for that, then surely the inside of the beast would be far more susceptible to damage. Case in point when the bomb is caught within Godzilla's mouth and detonated after Koichi has shot into it. Perhaps for anyone to question if his healing ability would have fallen under the realm of convenience if not for the previous establishment of such an ability in so many previous iterations. Then again, for this film to stand on its own, this is a perfectly legitimate idea for it having caused a significant level of damage, but not in it having been enough to kill the creature, and having only a portion of the damage be applied that it would allow for such heavier damage to be inflicted that his healing ability would no longer be a detriment to the mechanics and how this ability would function. But for the parameters to be established up front in accordance with how this ability is used is a clear indicator for how well utilized it had been in this exact moment. For the arrival of the warship Takao would the crew of the Shinsei Maru be so relieved, only for the audience to be so horrified by its introduction. For the knowledge that these few characters had only just barely survived, to then being forced to bear witness to this titan of terror as it switches targets from their small boat to the warship that had just arrived, only for the adjoining moment to be scored with a haunting melody simply titled Divine. with so many facets of that title implying such an otherworldly presence characterized by an entity of unfathomable proportions through its strength and ethereal glow emanating from its body. Such an apt name for the moment in which this creature, so deeply ingrained into the psyches of our heroes, to be hidden away beneath the ocean, to then illuminating the water with an unsettling glow, one which would invoke fear into the strongest of men before being expelled in a breath of ungodly power that annihilated what our heroes briefly entertained to be their salvation, only to recoil in silent horror at the destruction brought forth by this ability, an ability encapsulated by the swirling azure breath of demonic hellfire, only for the very same entity which expelled that breath of unholy death to emerge in such a state of establishing his might with one final roar before submerging into the depths once more. The threat has been established and the danger is real. There is no hiding from it. And yet, despite this, Mr. Noda informs Shikishima that there is nothing that they can do, while the government acknowledges that there is nothing that they will do. An ever-growing series of misfortunes for these characters, but for the blatant disregard for what will inevitably occur is a sad and unfortunate reality. Not simply for the parameters set in this world, but rather for the basis in real-life instances as well. Akitsu explains it perfectly. Information control is their specialty, the structure of a neo-imperialistic Japan detailing the hierarchy of power within the regulation of information distribution, going so far as to lie to its citizens about the status of the war. Whether it be a victory or a defeat, any battle could and would have been perceived as a victory, with how intricately carved these lies have become to only continue to stack against them, only for it to eventually crumble beneath their very eyes. But to wave it off for the weak explanation in there being mass hysteria and confusion, for this government to acknowledge the threat, though it may be a relevant point, it still highlights the fundamental issue that this governing body would be so apt in denying any involvement, to shy away from the responsibility that they have been given. That the US-Soviet relations would be so dire in preventing any measure of aid that the people of Japan would turn to their own government, only to be turned away all the same. A turning point that Shikishima understood all too well, for having been forced to obey a series of orders that were all for naught, if only having followed through for a death that would have ended in vain, with having disobeyed those orders from his commanding officers whose repercussions led to the deaths of innocent men, only to be forced to obey these new orders issued by that same governing body to not intervene in the rising threat of Godzilla, that this would have only led to another series of deaths all the same. No matter the orders, no matter the decisions made, the outcomes would only ever remain the same. Shikishima's trauma having resulted from those orders that it would bleed into his everyday life to having affected Noriko and Akiko. Noriko having been so grateful to Shikishima for having allowed them to stay, in turn leading to her being afforded the opportunity to succeed on her own right by means of acquiring a job, a feat that was generally uncommon for most women in post-war Japan. Shikishima's initial shock not necessarily attributed to any measure of bigotry, but for a measure of inadequacy in his feeling the need to be useful. For so long had his guilt been eating away at his conscience that his being able to look after a young woman and orphan child allowed him some semblance of purpose, that he could afford to take care of those that he had grown to love, only for her to eventually undertake the responsibility for her own success that he would be so confused for not understanding why she would want to leave when he had believed them to be happy together. His subconscious being aware of his feelings for this woman that he would be unable to voice his sentiments, the window for Noriko only continuing to close the longer he would keep choosing to wait on. The longer he is waiting only being a detriment as he begins to realize that the stability that he had cultivated beginning to crumble, that he would break down in perhaps one of the strongest scenes in this film. A man having fled his duty, having led to the deaths of many innocent men, only to return to a world decimated by the very war that he had refused to fight, to a home with no family. The foundation for his mental state having only begun to heal comes shattering down as the people he has loved would choose to eventually leave. A man, when confronted, would finally express his grief and inner turmoil to this young woman, this kindred spirit, a woman who had, much like Shikishima, lost her parents, her friends, her home, and her livelihood to the war. To bear witness to this young man break down completely to the point in believing his death had already occurred, that Noriko and Akiko were nothing but the ghosts conjured up by a dead man, haunted by the past, being punished for his former transgressions. This young woman barely held together, but standing strong in her attempt to convince this former soldier, this broken man, that he is alive. If Noriko was to live, then surely he could too by making that choice, a choice in deciding to live. His decision being the ultimate mark for his character when Godzilla's landfall was to be the ultimate test. If he was to survive this creature having returned from the past, then he would surely be just as steadfast in surviving the future. a future that he would only just narrowly survive, as this monster would have made its landfall in the city of Ginza, its unholy rage crushing the streets below with every step, destroying the district with deadly precision, crushing any opposition in its path, sweeping through the foundation of the city. The might of the military being so futile in its attempt to stop this creature that the end point would be the most destruction that the city had ever witnessed. For this creature to emerge from the smoke in an unholy light, its vengeance ready to be enacted, with every dorsal fin thrust from the body being one step closer to unleashing the nuclear bomb that is Godzilla's atomic breath. A bomb that had spewed forth a wave of hellish might as the ensuing explosion engulfed the entirety of the city. Such a force for this breath of destruction that the very power it expelled was enough to vaporize the very air in creating a vacuum, one in which the remnants of the city would rush forward to fill as hundreds of thousands of tons of rubble shot forth to fill that void. A cataclysmic explosion dwarfing even this titan of terror as he stands still, bearing witness to the carnage as it washes over the land, with its gaze ever lingering as the essence of death settles over the city, its ever-looming presence a reminder that this very cloud of death could dwarf the nuclear abomination that created it. Yet despite the difference, he is the dominant force, a force through which his might is established with a roar, not to the heavens, but to the very destruction that he had wrought. Just as the atomic blast had decimated this creature into becoming something far more terrifying than any man could envision, so too would this creature enact that same level of pain upon this country. The ever-looming cloud settling amidst the destruction wrought through which this monster would display his rage in inflicting that same level of damage done unto his being. The destruction that Shikishima must wade through once again upon the realization that Noriko had died. That this war, this creature, had returned yet again to take away that which had only allowed him to live. Its black rain washing over Shikishima, a wave of turmoil let loose through the agonized shrieks of this young man having bore witness to this land being completely annihilated. A wave of death whose effects have brought this country to the negative zone. There are no public forums, there are no statements to be made, there is only mourning for the souls lost, with its citizens left to search through the wreckage and quietly burying the fallen. Never before has such events been so deeply characterized in showcasing how damaged the families had become following such an event. For the very first film to have displayed this so abundantly that the precedent was set for so many of the films that followed so closely thereafter. Its prominence having been shown here for the sake of displaying its characters as the framework for this story. A story in which this young man, who has already lost everything, has only decided upon the ultimatum of death. Not one born out of sorrow, but of sacrifice. That his death would no longer be merited for the sake of easing a guilty conscience, but for securing the freedom of his country. The freedom of the burden of the new war that has emerged in the form of this nuclear behemoth. His determination so set in his agreement towards having banded together with so many former men of war to seek out the destruction of this growing threat. A plan in which this country's decimation had finally been halted, not for its leaders having repented for the damage that they had inflicted upon their citizens, but for those very individuals having fought that very war being faced with another one yet again. Nothing so fortuitous that could stand out to such a degree more than the very citizens that had suffered from such a threat at the hands of this war and being forced into another one. Yet persevering through this challenge by means of having been given what they had been denied before, a choice to fight, not for the demands of any corrupt officials or those seeking power through conquest, but for the choice in defending those that they love, for the choice to keep others out of harm's way, a choice through which Noda would assemble a team of former servicemen to thwart this ever-growing threat, a plan through which no might would be utilized as an offense, one which would involve the use of several decommissioned warships to lure Godzilla to the deepest part of the ocean, to wrap him in an inescapable line and to sink it with freon gas. A plan that may have seemed so impossible for Akitsu to have noted Godzilla being of the sea that this plan would involve using that very facet of his biology to their advantage, one in which the rapid sinking of this creature would bring about its demise. For much as any other creature of the ocean would be unable to adapt to the rapid change in pressure, so too would such a monstrous creation bear such similarities in its weaknesses, that should its initial success be halted in having sunken Godzilla so quickly for its inability to adapt quickly enough that the backup plan would take immediate effect thereafter, one in which this creature would be brought to the surface for its inability to adapt quickly enough to the rapid decompression, that the very ocean whose depths bore this abomination would be responsible for its end. Though this plan had so meticulously divulged to its citizens the possibility in any hope being garnered, this film is still not afraid to express the grim reality set upon this world. For the promise of survival being cause enough for consideration, would the film still take the time to depict these individuals as being so cautious, that most other films would have made the mistake in having its leaders make such an inspirational speech that will be the rallying point for every individual to make the choice and so blindly accepting the mission without considering the ramifications. Such as it is that the strengths of this specific moment would shine through the fact that several of those very men would have decided to leave, not out of cowardice, but for their choice to live for their families. A choice that is both commendable and able to be understood so easily for the reasoning in which these men, who had been forced into a war that they had only just barely survived, to be failed by their government yet again, for the responsibility in dealing with a new threat to fall onto their shoulders yet again, only in accepting this request upon the understanding that no one else would be able to do it but themselves, that their willing acceptance and the possibility of death, if only to secure the future for those individuals to never having been forced to witness the horrors of war, would prove just how honorable these former servicemen are. Not for an ultimatum of death, but a promise to live for the future. A promise perfectly encapsulated when Captain Akitsu denies Mizushima the chance to participate, not from a sense of superiority or vanity, but in his statement that never having been to war is something that Mizushima can be truly proud of. A point that Mizushima can only barely grasp, not from a position of ignorance, but of shock and sadness. Sadness in knowing that his fellow crew could die. Sadness in the possibility that he may never see his friends again. Sadness in that he is being denied the chance to protect the country and people he loves without realizing that the captain and the others were doing the exact same thing in denying this young man that opportunity. A point that is finalized when, upon the begging of Mizushima, when the captain simply says, "We leave you the future." How fitting for the piece to be accompanying this scene to be titled Pride, if not being so appropriate in its application, that Mr. Noda would display such pride towards his fellow former servicemen, pride towards the men who were willing to once again lay down their lives for their country, pride for the immeasurable level of humility, kindness, and bravery exuding from these men accompanying him on what is essentially a suicide mission. That same pride was what Mizushima felt towards his friends for devising such a plan to defeat such a titanic threat. Such pride that he would be willing to die just to prove that, despite his youth and lack of experience with war, that he would still be so willing to die to defend his friends. For this to be made all the more heart-wrenching when Mizushima yells out that they were a team for so long, that the betrayal he would have felt inflicted by those individuals that he had spent so many years building a repertoire with, that it would be all the more heart-wrenching to see him being denied to fight for those that he loved, if not for the captain denying his request in order to protect the people that he loved. For it to be the only thing that would keep him from looking back in regret that he would continue walking forward without glancing back, all the while Mizushima is begging in pain and pride. Both ideologies can be understood. We had spent so long growing with these characters that we would not want any of them to die, but we understand the pride that they carry, pride for their beliefs, in their country, in their people, for all of it to build to such a gut-wrenching moment when we are forced to witness one of those young men being denied the chance to fight for his beliefs, for his home, for his friends, and for his family. Not for leaving Mizushima behind with an empty sense of longing, but leaving behind a future. Noda himself said it perfectly. I would take pride in a citizen-led effort that sacrifices no lives at all, and this is his way of doing it, despite how painful it may be to do so. One moment of brutal honesty is far better than a life of regret. A regret that Shikishima would no longer feel upon his decision to request a plane to lure Godzilla into the trap set by this team. For why else would Shikishima not have told anyone of his plan? And knowing fully well that upon revealing his plan that his friends would have immediately objected, that in him not doing so was him choosing to protect those that he held so close. What one may have viewed as being selfish for Shikishima choosing to sacrifice his life. Yet this was not to be viewed as an act of superficial glory, but to ensure the death of the monster that had plagued his nightmares, to ensure that no one should suffer from another Odo Island or Ginza City massacre. This decision having been solidified in his immediate request for any available plane to be located in order to lure Godzilla to the target area, wherein the local Kyushu J-7W Shinden fighter is brought forth. The local fighter Shinden, a plane so wholly unique for its purpose in its design in taking down enemy bombers, not as a destroyer, but as a defender. A vehicle whose implementation would be perfectly applicable for Shikishima's survival and overall goal. That the local Shinden having only been one of the very few in the production line to survive the war for the sake of having been produced in a limited supply. The irony in this ship lacking any true firepower through bombing by means of its main source of damage instead being 4 separate 30mm guns. Its specifications having been designed for the sole purpose and protection, not for the sake of a meaningless death through means of a kamikaze attack, but through its speed and lightweight design and its maneuverability lending favor to a higher advantage in aerial combat. A twist of fate in that advantage being undertaken by the same pilot who had once fled his duty in requesting the lead mechanic Tachibana to retrofit the plane with any and all available bombs to implement in his final attack. For this decision to further cement Tachibana's forgiveness of Shikishima that he would have urged him to release his regret and embrace the will to live. A will in which Tachibana believed Shikishima to have finally earned through that very willingness to finally fulfill the duty that he had once fled from so very long ago. That the entirety of Tachibana's willingness to accept the responsibility in repairing this vessel for Shikishima and for having realized that the coward that he had once encountered was no longer that man. That the man before him now had a reason to sacrifice his life, not for an empty promise of victory for his homeland, but for his choice in doing so to ensure the future of his country, that he would have then made the decision to forgive and help Shikishima. Just as Shikishima was to release his guilt, so too would Tachibana, an airplane mechanic conscripted to repair those planes for kamikaze pilots, that his responsibility in the war would have been in the explicit purpose in sending those young men to die. Here he is given the chance to repair this plane to send off one final pilot, not for the purpose in a failed death, but for a choice to allow this young man to live. Such a decision made that Tachibana would have recognized this sacrifice, that his decision to repair the vessel would have been the very reason for Shikishima's survival. For notice statement in this war having failed from so many deciding factors: poorly armored tanks, mismanagement of resources resulting in half of all deaths from disease and starvation, a lack of ejector seats, and kamikaze pilots, but for this war to be one not waged to the death, but one which sacrifices no lives at all. If man was to survive against this titan of terror, then by no means would it benefit such a war to be identified for being fought through the label of man versus nature, but rather nature versus nature. For Noda to have explained it so perfectly that conventional weaponry will carry no effects towards such a beast, but that they will be able to utilize the power of the sea against this behemoth. For if natural selection were to occur within nature, then nature itself would decide the outcome. For this monstrosity born of the sea, would he be unable to withstand the pressure inflicted upon being forced to such a depth at too quick a speed, would any victory be possible. Any other scenario for such a plan may have been deemed so ridiculous, if not having done the necessary and well-executed method in detailing the progression of its characters to have earned that payoff. A payoff wherein 4 decommissioned destroyers were tasked with bringing down Godzilla to the ocean floor. A plan which would have been deemed so ridiculously unbelievable if not for its practicality through such simplistic but effective maneuvers. Draw the attention of this beast, lure him to the sea, and enact the plan. This plan having already been given such an advantage for those radioactive energies having been so quickly expelled, and forcing such a small window of opportunity for this creature to wait to utilize this ability again. With this allowing for those warships to so quickly begin their assault that they would have so successfully brought this monstrosity down to the very depths with which he had once emerged, only for the sheer terror and the possibility of failure upon the realization of this creature having severed the very tools necessary to bring forth his demise, that no such hope would be left. That their only advantage in forcing this monster to the surface for the artificial decompression to destroy this creature, that no such measure of success would emerge. Nothing in allowing for these men to ensure the survival of their people, for the realization that no force alive could destroy this entity. Despite this, they still make the attempt. A fruitless endeavor made all the more horrifying for these men being so willing to ensure the future that they would destroy their only means of successfully enacting this plan. A plan only set to fail, only until an army of tugboats arrive. Not an army of power, but of people. The people that had fought their government's war. The people that had witnessed their fellow servicemen forced to fight a war that had ended in fire and ruin. The people that were forced to bear witness to their country being devastated anew by this archaic beast of nuclear armament. Those very people having pooled together whatever resources available to offer whatever aid is necessary, and being so willing for the fight for the future. Every small tugboat only ever struggling against the strain through which they are finally able to emerge victorious. With this creature having finally been forced to the surface in such a state of damage so irreparable, and having been ripped apart to such a degree that its only instinct was to destroy those that had brought upon such carnage upon its body. An event made all the more terrifying for the realization of Noda's words prior in detailing this creature being forced to wait upon the dispelment of its heat ray, not only for the regeneration of its energy to expel another heat ray later on, but for its body to accumulate the level of damage inflicted to heal. That initial statement being compounded for this creature having been ensnared in a sea of agony, that it would ignore the consequences of such an action of expelling its heat ray before the regeneration had even occurred, that it would continue with its attack in a blinded fury. The horror of this radioactive death emerging only highlighted through the silence accompanying this moment. For all of the fear marring the features of these men that they would stare death right in the face and face it head on. This fear being what emboldened Shikishima to return, his fear having finally abandoned his being. For that fear to have consumed the entirety of his being and what allowed him to so easily make the choice to let fear override his conscience. Such fear that would have led to the deaths of his fellow men. For that fear to have finally been left behind on that island, that he would be ready to transform that fear to pure will for being so willing to make such a sacrifice. A sacrifice for his people, for the knowledge in his death being what would allow for those that he had pushed away for so many years that he would ensure their survival, only to make one additional sacrifice, not of his life, but of his guilt. Guilt for the deaths of those troops on Odo Island, for the deaths of his parents, for the people of Ginza, for the death of Noriko. One final flight, one final mission, no longer as a kamikaze pilot, but as one man, not set to survive, but to live. His life no longer being set by the guilt for the lives that he had lost. Those lives lost no longer being carried with this man as a memento of guilt, rather than a collection of the past to carry with him into battle. He is to carry a photo of his future, a reminder for why he chose to fight, for a woman who had chosen to live, for the woman who had brought a child with her into this man's life, for the woman who had saved his life and secured his future. For this woman having enabled him to live, that he would carry the responsibility to ensure the future for those that he loved, rather than sacrifice, a choice to ultimately live. This ultimatum having saved his life, while having ensured the defeat of his nightmares and having driven that vehicle of his former life into the mouth of his enemy. An enemy having been swallowed by the very waters that housed his being, that would have ultimately been marked as his grave. A grave in which these men would have acknowledged this monstrosity having been defeated, that no exclamations of pride would have emerged if only for these men having stood in silent affirmation of their fallen enemy. Their salute not only respecting the fight given by their enemy, but for the acknowledgement of every soul lost, that their lives would be honored in death. Not as a period of mourning for the lives lost, but of solemn acceptance in those deaths that those lives would no longer be mourned, but celebrated. The end of this fight having signaled the end of a new war. For at the very end has Shikishima's war finally ended, ceased to be the nightmares that had once plagued his frightened mind in an incessant loop, banished by the darkness that subsequently gave birth to this heavenly light, a light which would shine ever so bright upon his arrival to the hospital, only to finally embrace that light through Noriko, so heavily injured and traumatized. And yet, what she begs to learn is if his war is finally over. This young woman who would only continue to care for others, even at the behest of her own health. A state of health that is left with a deep sense of foreboding upon having witnessed the black mark moving so quickly within her neck. A mark made all the more horrifying upon the realization of its background, that with the combination of this creature's healing ability being so well established, with the many chunks of flesh that had plagued the cityscape after the destruction set by Godzilla, would this only finalize such a horrifying twist. That those pieces of flesh having been the only indicator for how this young woman could have survived such an event if not for this creature first having taken hold of this young woman. This genetic abomination having latched onto her being as it would a parasite whose being would lead to a life of endless agony for the radiation slowly infecting the victim. A victim who, much like post-war Japan, persevered to live. For every act performed by these individuals would have carried such levels of courage, if not for the greatest feat of courage in the choice to live.